The forest was a monster and it was hungry. Everyone in the Mooncrest pack knew it. They stood gathered at the very edge of the Darkwood, a place where the trees grew so close together they blotted out the sun even at noon, where the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and things that had rotted long ago. The pack members, strong warriors and watchful hunters, shuffled their feet nervously, their eyes darting from the oppressive line of trees to the man who stood before them. He was a mountain of a man, rippling with muscle and a power that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath his boots. This was Rex, their Alpha King. His face was carved from granite, set in a permanent scowl of disappointment, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept over his people with a searing intensity that made many of them look away. He was furious. A recent skirmish with a rival pack had ended poorly, not because they were outnumbered but because in Rex's eyes his wolves had been soft. They had hesitated. They had shown fear. And to Rex, fear was a disease and weakness was its symptom. It had to be cut out. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low growl that rumbled through the clearing, quieter than a shout but far more terrifying. "You call yourselves strong?" he snarled, his words lashing like a whip. "You eat my food, you sleep safely in my territory, and you offer me nothing but failure." He began to pace, a predator trapped in a cage of his own making. A pack is only as strong as its weakest member. And I look around now and I see weakness. It makes me sick. He stopped his pacing and turned to face the Darkwood, his broad back to his pack. "So, we will clean house. Tonight. I offer a challenge. To any wolf here who feels the sting of my words, who knows they are not strong enough to stand beside me." He turned back, his gaze sweeping over the Omegas, the lowest members of the pack, the caretakers and cleaners who hung their heads in shame. "Step forward. Enter the Darkwood. Survive the night. No weapons. No help. Just you, your wolf, and every nightmare that forest holds. Do that and you prove your worth. You earn your place. You survive the night and I'll spare you. You fail." He let the sentence hang in the air, the unspoken meaning more frightening than any graphic threat. Failure meant death. Everyone knew it. The challenge was a death sentence with a sliver of hope, a hope no one had ever managed to grasp. The forest always won. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the pack. No one moved. No one breathed. The idea was madness. The Darkwood was not just trees and animals. It was ancient, it was angry, and it was hungry. Stories were told of seasoned warriors getting lost just a few feet inside its borders, never to be seen again. To go in alone as an Omega? It was a fantasy, a quick and brutal end. Rex waited, his impatience growing. "No one?" he mocked, a cruel smile touching his lips. "I thought as much. It seems the weak don't even have the courage to." Movement. A slight shift in the crowd. The Omegas parted, and a single figure stepped out from their midst. A collective gasp rippled through the pack. It was Cora. She was small for a werewolf, with a slender frame that seemed better suited to mending clothes than fighting battles. Her hair was the color of dark earth, and her eyes were a warm, gentle brown. She never spoke. No one could remember ever hearing her voice. She communicated with subtle gestures, with expressive eyes, with written words on rare scraps of paper. She was the quietest soul in the entire pack, and now she was walking calmly toward the furious Alpha King. Rex stared, his arrogance faltering for a single, stunned second. He blinked. This quiet little thing was answering his challenge? A laugh, harsh and disbelieving, burst from his chest. "You," he said, the word dripping with scorn. "You would last 5 minutes. Go back to the kitchens, little mouse. This is not a game." Cora didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She simply stopped before him and lifted her chin, meeting his stormy gaze with a steadiness that was utterly shocking. Her eyes weren't pleading, they were resolved. They held a quiet, unshakable strength that Rex had never seen in any of his burly warriors. She nodded once, a sharp, definitive gesture. She was accepting his challenge. The pack watched in utter disbelief. Jax, the beta, Rex's most trusted friend, took a half step forward, his face etched with concern. "Rex, she doesn't understand what she's doing," he said quietly, but Rex silenced him with a sharp look. The Alpha King was intrigued now. This was no longer about weeding out weakness. This was a bizarre spectacle. He wanted to see how this would play out. He wanted to see the forest break this strangely brave creature. "So be it," he growled, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper meant only for her. "The sun has touched the treetops. Your night begins now. If you can survive the night, I'll spare you. Remember that promise when the shadows start to move." He gestured with his head toward the wall of twisted trees. Cora didn't look back at the pack. She didn't look at Rex again. She took a deep, steadying breath, squared her slender shoulders and walked forward. The darkness of the Darkwood seemed to lean out to meet her, swallowing her whole the moment she passed the first tree. 1 second she was there, the next she was gone, consumed by the monster. The pack stood in stunned silence for a long moment, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Rex crossed his massive arms over his chest, a satisfied smirk back on his face. He expected to hear a scream within the hour. He turned to address his people to drive his lesson home, but a strange, nagging feeling pricked at the back of his mind. It was the memory of her eyes. They hadn't held a single ounce of fear. Only quiet, terrifying resolve. And for the first time in a very long time, the Alpha King felt a sliver of doubt. The silence that followed Cora's disappearance into the Darkwood was heavier than any sound the pack had ever heard. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of disbelief and morbid anticipation. All eyes remained glued to the spot where the slender Omega had been swallowed by the oppressive gloom, as if expecting the forest to immediately spit her back out, broken and defeated. Rex let the silence hang, using it as his final tool to hammer his lesson into his pack. He scanned their faces, seeing the fear he wanted to see, the understanding of his absolute power and the consequences of weakness. With a final, dismissive grunt, he turned on his heel. "The show is over," he announced, his voice cutting through the tense air. "Back to your duties. Remember what you saw here. Remember the price of failure." The pack dispersed slowly, murmuring amongst themselves, casting nervous glances back at the treeline. They moved like ghosts, the image of the quiet girl walking to her doom burned into their minds. Jax, the beta, lingered the longest, his brow furrowed with a concern that felt like a physical weight in his chest. He looked from the unforgiving forest to his alphas retreating back, a conflict brewing within him. Rex was his king, his friend, but this felt less like justice and more like a cruel execution. He knew Cora. She was the one who left bundles of healing herbs for the sick pups, who mended torn cloaks without being asked, whose silent presence in the kitchens was a calm constant. She wasn't a warrior, but she wasn't weak. This challenge was a mismatch, a predator toying with something gentle before the kill. With a heavy sigh, Jax finally turned and followed the others, the coming night feeling darker than any he could remember. Inside the Darkwood, the world changed completely. The fading orange light of sunset was instantly extinguished, replaced by a deep, green-tinged twilight that filtered through a dense canopy of gnarled branches woven tightly together like a cage. The air was cold and damp, carrying a million smells: wet moss, decaying leaves, the musky scent of unseen animals, and something else, something old and metallic like blood on stone. Every sound was amplified and distorted. The crunch of a single twig under her own foot echoed like a gunshot. The hoot of an owl sounded like a mournful warning. The wind didn't whistle, it whispered through the leaves, hissing words she couldn't quite understand. Cora's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, so loud she was sure every creature for miles could hear it. Pure, instinctual terror threatened to paralyze her. Every shadow seemed to twist and move independently. Every rustle in the undergrowth was a monster ready to pounce. Her human mind screamed at her to run, to find a way out, to scream for help that would never come. But beneath the terror, something else stirred. Her wolf, her Omega wolf, was not a fighter. It was a survivor. It didn't respond to fear with rage, but with a hyper-focused calm. It pushed the panic down, forcing her senses to sharpen, to process the world not as a series of threats, but as a map of information. She forced herself to stand perfectly still, to breathe slowly and silently through her nose. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting her other senses paint a picture. To her left, the smell of stagnant water. But to her right, the sharper, cleaner scent of pine and faintly of stone. Better. She opened her eyes and began to move, not with the frantic energy of prey, but with the deliberate, silent grace of a hunter who knew she was also being hunted. Her steps were placed with painstaking care, avoiding dry leaves and brittle sticks. Her first goal was shelter. The air was getting colder, and the forest floor would leach the heat from her body while she slept. She remembered lessons from the pack elders, stories told to scare pups, but within those stories were nuggets of truth. She found what she was looking for half buried in a hillside, a dark, jagged opening partially concealed by thick ivy and thorny bushes. It was a cave, or at least a deep crevice in the rock. The entrance was small, too small for a large predator. A smell wafted from it, dirt and old bones, but nothing recent. It was vacant. But before she could even think about entering, her Omega instincts kicked in again. Protection. Warding. She moved away from the cave entrance, her eyes scanning the forest floor. She found patches of a specific silvery-leafed plant she recognized, moonweed. It was used by the pack healers to soothe fevers, but to most forest animals, its smell was sharp and unpleasant, a warning. She gathered great armfuls of it, crushing the leaves gently to release their potent odor. She made a wide circle around her chosen shelter, creating a barrier of the smell. She found a gorse bush with sharp thorns and dragged a heavy branch of it, scratching her arms in the process, to partially block the entrance. It wasn't a fortress, but it was a statement. This place is claimed, it is protected, it is unpleasant. Stay away. Thirst came next. Her mouth was dry from fear and exertion. Following the faint sound of trickling water, she found a thin, clear stream cutting through the rocks. She knew better than to drink without checking. She waited, watching. A small, mouse-like creature scurried to the stream, drank its fill, and scampered away unharmed. It was safe. She cupped her hands and drank, the cold water feeling like the most precious thing she had ever tasted. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. Again she relied on the knowledge she had quietly accumulated her whole life, watching, listening, learning while others were busy showing off their strength. She found a bush heavy with dark, plump berries. But she didn't just eat them. She watched. She saw birds pecking at them without issue. She crushed one and smelled it, sweet, not bitter. She touched a tiny bit of juice to her lip, waiting for a tingle or burn that never came. Only then did she allow herself to eat a small handful, just enough to quiet the ache in her belly. As full darkness fell, the true character of the Darkwood emerged. The whispers on the wind grew louder. In the distance, a chorus of howls erupted, but they were wrong, twisted and cacophonous, not the unified song of a pack but the chaotic screaming of things that hunted alone and for sport. Something large and heavy moved through the trees not 50 paces from her cave, its breathing a low, rattling snuffle. Cora froze inside her thorny den, her hand clamped over her own mouth to stop any sound from escaping. She could smell it, a rank, predatory odor. It paused right at the edge of her circle of crushed moonweed. It snorted, a sound of disgust and irritation. It lingered for what felt like an eternity, then moved on, its footsteps fading back into the depths of the forest. Cora didn't sleep. She sat curled in the deepest part of her little crevice, her arms wrapped around her knees, and she listened. She listened to the nightmare symphony of the forest, to the sounds of hunting and dying. She felt the ancient, cold energy of the place pressing in on her from all sides, trying to seep into her bones and convince her to give up, to let the terror win. But with every passing hour, every small victory, the safety of her shelter, the quenching of her thirst, the satisfaction of her hunger, a tiny ember of confidence glowed brighter within her. She was not a warrior. She could not fight these horrors. But she could understand them. She could outthink them. She could survive them. The night was an endless, terrifying crawl, but she was crawling right along with it, minute by agonizing minute, waiting for a dawn that felt like it would never come. Back at the Mooncrest Pack's main camp, the night had passed in a strange, suspended state. The usual sounds of a pack settling in for the evening, the low chatter, the crackle of the central bonfire, the playful yips of pups being ushered to bed, were all muted, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Everyone was thinking about the Darkwood. Everyone was thinking about Cora. The image of her small, straight-backed figure walking into that wall of darkness was seared into every mind. Some, the more hardened warriors, shook their heads with a grim certainty. It was a shame, but the Alpha's lesson was a harsh one, and the weak had no place in it. Others, the Omegas and the caregivers, moved through their tasks with downcast eyes and heavy hearts, feeling the loss of one of their own as a chilling preview of what could happen to any of them. Rex, the Alpha King, had retired to his large, solitary lodge built from dark timber and stone, a structure that mirrored his own imposing presence. He had dismissed the event from his mind, or so he told himself. He ate his meal, reviewed patrol maps with Jax, and attempted to project an air of unbothered finality. The challenge had been issued, the fool had accepted, and the forest would do what it always did. It was the natural order. Yet, as the deep night wore on, a peculiar restlessness took hold of him. He found himself standing at his window, which faced the general direction of the Darkwood, his arms crossed, his gaze distant. He wasn't worried, he insisted inwardly. He was curious. How long had she lasted? Had she run? Had she fought? The memory of her eyes, that unwavering calm in the face of his rage, kept resurfacing like a stubborn weed. It didn't make sense. It challenged everything he knew about strength and hierarchy. Annoyed by his own wandering thoughts, he finally growled and went to his bed, though sleep was a long time coming, filled with distorted dreams of silent stairs and whispering trees. As the first faint hint of pale gray light began to bleed into the eastern sky, the entire pack seemed to hold its breath. It was a silent, collective ritual. Wolves began to emerge from their dens and lodges, not summoned by any command, but drawn by a morbid, unspoken need to witness the conclusion of the Alpha's brutal lesson. They gathered once more at the edge of the clearing, their numbers even greater than the night before. A heavy dew coated the grass and a thin, chilly mist clung to the ground, making the world seem ghostly and unreal. All eyes were fixed on the treeline, a stark black scar against the gradually lightening sky. Rex stood at the front of the crowd, Jax at his right shoulder. The Alpha's face was a mask of cold, impassive stone. He expected nothing. He anticipated the sun to rise fully, to illuminate an empty forest edge, and for life to return to normal. The lesson would be cemented. His authority would be absolute. He shifted his weight, a slight, impatient movement. "This is a waste of time," he muttered to Jax, his voice a low rumble. "The forest doesn't give back what it takes." Jax didn't reply. His keen beta senses were focused intently on the tree line. He was about to agree to suggest they disperse the crowd when he saw it. A flicker of movement. A slight shift in the pattern of shadows between two massive, twisted oaks. He stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "Rex," he said quietly, his voice taut. "Look." A murmur started at the back of the crowd and swept forward like a wave. Everyone saw it now. A figure was emerging from the darkness. It moved slowly, painfully, but it moved with purpose. It was Cora. She was almost unrecognizable. Her clothes were torn and smeared with dirt and dark green moss. Scratches marked her arms and cheeks. Her hair was a tangled mess of leaves and twigs. She was limping slightly, favoring one leg, and she moved with the exhausted, plodding gait of someone who had used every last ounce of their strength. But she was upright. She was breathing. And her eyes, though shadowed with profound fatigue, were clear and focused. She walked out of the Darkwood as the first true ray of sunlight broke over the horizon, painting her in a golden light, making her seem like a ghost given solid form. The silence from the pack was absolute, a vacuum of pure, unadulterated shock. Jaws hung open. Eyes widened in disbelief. This was impossible. It was unheard of. Omegas didn't survive the Darkwood. No one did. Rex felt the world tilt underneath him. The air left his lungs in a quiet, stunned rush. His arms, which had been crossed so confidently over his chest, fell slack to his sides. The mask of cold indifference shattered completely, replaced by a look of raw, utter astonishment. He stared, his stormy eyes wide, tracing every scratch on her skin, every tear in her clothing, the way she held herself with a weary dignity that was more powerful than any victory pose. She had done it. She had actually done it. The quiet little mouse had faced the monster and walked away. The words of his own challenge echoed hollowly in his mind. "If you can survive the night, I'll spare you." He was a king bound by his own decree. Cora finally stopped a few feet from the tree line, her task complete. She didn't look at the stunned crowd. She didn't look at Jax. Her gaze lifted and found only one person, Rex. She looked directly at him, and in her eyes, there was no triumph, no gloating, no accusation. There was only the quiet, bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had endured the unendurable, and the simple, unspoken question, "I survived. What now?" Rex could only stare back, his mind a roaring whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and a strange, dawning respect that felt entirely foreign to him. He, the Alpha King who had never been at a loss for words, who commanded with a voice that could shake the earth, was completely and utterly speechless. The victor of his impossible challenge stood before him, silent and waiting, and he had absolutely nothing to say. The silence that followed Cora's return was a living thing, thick and heavy and humming with the shock of dozens of witnesses. It stretched on, second after agonizing second, broken only by the morning chorus of birds in the distant safer parts of the woods, a sound that felt cruelly out of place. All eyes were darting between the ragged breathing proof of survival and their Alpha King, whose stony composure had fractured into pure, unvarnished astonishment. Rex's mind, usually a sharp tool of command and strategy, was a chaotic jumble. Every rule he lived by, every certainty about strength and weakness, had just been upended by this silent, scratched-up girl. The weight of his own promise pressed down on him. He had spoken the words before the entire pack. To go back on them now would shatter his authority more completely than any battle loss ever could. He had to acknowledge this. He had to accept it. He took a single heavy step forward, the sound of his boot on the dew-soaked grass unnaturally loud. He cleared his throat, the sound rough, and when he spoke, his voice lacked its usual thunderous confidence. It was quieter, almost hesitant. The challenge was set. The words came out stiff, formal. The terms were met. He forced himself to meet her gaze, those calm, exhausted brown eyes that seemed to see right through him. "You will stay." It wasn't a welcome. It was a pronouncement, a royal decree forced from a king who felt anything but regal in that moment. Having uttered the necessary words, he seemed unable to bear the staring any longer. With a last lingering look of utter bewilderment at Cora, he turned sharply on his heel and strode away, his retreating back radiating a turmoil that everyone could feel. The spell broke. The pack erupted into a wave of murmurs, the noise swelling as everyone began talking at once, their voices a mixture of awe, confusion, and disbelief. A few of the older Omegas, their faces etched with empathy, moved toward Cora as if to help her, but they stopped short, unsure. She was different now. She wasn't just the quiet girl who mended clothes anymore. She was the one who had faced the Darkwood and won. She occupied a strange new space that no one understood. It was Jax who stepped into the void left by Rex's abrupt departure. The beta moved with a natural, calming authority, his expression one of genuine concern and respect. He gently waved the gathering crowd back. "Give her space," he said, his voice firm but kind. "She needs to breathe." He approached Cora slowly, giving her every chance to shy away. She didn't. She just watched him, her exhaustion evident in the slight droop of her shoulders. "Cora," Jack said, his voice softer now. I don't even have the words. Let's get you cleaned up. Get some food in you." He didn't try to touch her or guide her. He simply gestured toward the healer's den, a small, herb-scented lodge set a little apart from the others, and started walking, glancing back to see if she would follow. After a moment's hesitation, she did. Her steps were slow and measured, each one seeming to cost her effort. Inside the den, the healer, an old wolf named Alara, fussed over her with a motherly cluck of her tongue, applying salves to her scratches and giving her a warm, bitter tea for the shock. Jax waited outside, giving her privacy but making his presence known. He returned with a bowl of thick stew and a hunk of fresh bread, setting it on a low table beside the cot she sat on. Cora ate slowly, methodically, her manners neat even in her ragged state. When she was done, she looked at Jax and gave a small, grateful nod. Jax pulled up a stool and sat nearby, not too close, just present. "Rex. Well, he doesn't know what to do with you," Jax said with a slight, wry smile, breaking the silence. He's never been speechless before. "I think I enjoyed it." He was trying to lighten the mood to see if she would react. A flicker of something, amusement, passed through her eyes, but she remained silent. Jax tried a different tack. He wasn't like the others who either ignored her or grew frustrated by her silence. He treated it as normal. "I have to know," he said, his tone genuinely curious, not demanding. "How did you do it? The forest, it breaks seasoned warriors. What did you do out there?" For a long moment, Cora just looked at him. Then her eyes scanned the room. They landed on a small slate and a piece of chalk that Alara used for noting herb supplies. Slowly, stiffly, she rose, retrieved them, and returned to her cot. Jax watched, fascinated. She held the slate in her lap, her brow furrowed in concentration for a second. Then her hand began to move. The scratch of chalk on slate was the only sound. She wasn't writing quickly, she was drawing. She sketched with a surprising deftness, a simple, clear drawing of a cave behind thorns. Then she drew a circle around it and little squiggles to represent smell. Next to it, she drew a berry bush and a stream. She held the slate up for him to see. Jax leaned forward, studying the crude but effective diagram. Understanding dawned on his face. "You didn't fight," he murmured, awe creeping back into his voice. "You found shelter. You used the forest itself. You used moonweed to ward things off, didn't you? You found food and water you knew was safe. It was a strategy of intelligence, of knowledge, of patience. It was the exact opposite of the brute force Rex valued above all else." Cora nodded, her expression serious. She wiped the slate clean with the edge of her sleeve and wrote a single word in clear, neat letters. "Listened." Jack stared at the word, then back at her face. A wide, impressed grin spread across his features. "You listened," he repeated softly. "By the moon, Cora. You're amazing." In that moment, any lingering doubt he might have had about her vanished, replaced by a solid, unwavering respect. He saw the strength Rex was too blind to see. He saw a potential ally and perhaps a key to getting through to his stubborn, hardened friend. He made a decision then and there. He would keep an eye on her, not because Rex ordered it but because he wanted to. He wanted to understand this quiet, incredible survivor. A genuine friendship, built on a foundation of mutual respect, had its first fragile roots in the chalk dust of that simple slate. The days that followed Cora's return from the Darkwood settled into a new, strange rhythm for the Mooncrest pack. The initial shockwave of her survival had subsided, but the undercurrent of change it had triggered was far from over. Cora herself moved through her usual tasks, mending torn leather, gathering herbs for the healer, helping in the kitchens, but the air around her was different. Where before she had been nearly invisible, now she was the subject of constant, sidelong glances. Whispers followed her, not of malice yet, but of pure, unadulterated curiosity. The other Omegas treated her with a kind of reverent awe, as if she were touched by something magical, while some of the warriors watched her with narrowed, suspicious eyes, as if her victory had been a trick that had yet to be uncovered. She accepted it all with the same quiet grace she had always possessed, her silence now feeling less like weakness and more like a deep, unreadable mystery. For Rex, the Alpha King, the world had been tilted off its axis, and he was struggling desperately to right it. He threw himself into his duties with a ferocious intensity, drilling his warriors until they dropped from exhaustion, patrolling the borders himself, his presence a storm cloud of brooding energy. He barked orders, settled disputes with a snap of his jaws, and tried to project an image of absolute, unshaken control. But his mind was not on his work. It was constantly pulled away, tugged by an invisible thread toward the quiet Omega who had dismantled his entire understanding of the world. He found his eyes searching for her in the crowd, catching glimpses of her bent over a task, her face a picture of concentration. The memory of her standing at the forest's edge, scratched and triumphant, was burned onto the back of his eyelids. It was an obsession, a puzzle he could not solve, and it infuriated and fascinated him in equal measure. The first overture was clumsy, almost comical. He was striding through the central clearing after a long, frustrating meeting about border tensions, his mood blacker than ever when he saw her. She was sitting on a low stump outside the healer's den, meticulously sorting a basket of herbs into neat piles, her movements efficient and graceful. Rex stopped dead in his tracks. His heart gave a stupid, involuntary lurch. He needed to talk to her. He needed to understand. But how does a king demand answers from someone who doesn't speak? He stood there for a full minute, a mountain of indecision, before he turned and marched toward his own lodge. He emerged a moment later clutching something in his large hand, a brand-new leather-bound journal and a set of charcoal pencils he'd been given as a tribute from a neighboring pack and had never used. They felt absurdly small and delicate in his grasp. He walked back over to her, his steps heavier than necessary. Cora looked up, her expression neutral but watchful. Rex thrust the items toward her, his face a mask of gruff embarrassment. "Here," he grunted, the word coming out more like a command than a gift. "Jack said you communicate this way. Seems inefficient. But if you're going to be here, you might as well have proper tools." It was the worst possible way to give a gift, but it was the only way he knew how. Cora looked from his face to the beautiful journal and pencils and back again. For a terrifying second, he thought she might refuse them, might throw his awkward offering back in his face. But then slowly she reached out and took them. Her fingers brushed against his palm, and the contact was like a tiny spark of lightning. She held the journal to her chest almost protectively and offered him a small, genuine nod of thanks. It wasn't a smile, but it was something. It was acceptance. Rex felt a bizarre sense of victory, as if he'd just won a major battle instead of successfully delivering a peace offering. He gave a stiff nod in return and walked away, his mind already racing with what he might ask her first. The next day he found his excuse. He approached her as she was drawing water from the well. He had a rolled-up map in his hand, a problem he'd been wrestling with for weeks. It was a strategic dilemma about resource allocation between the northern and southern sectors of his territory. He unrolled it with a flourish, holding it down on a flat stone. "The streams here are drying up," he said, pointing a thick finger at a spot on the map, his tone all business. "The hunting parties are arguing over territory. I need to move a group south, but it weakens our northern flank. What would you do?" He wasn't really expecting an answer. It was a test, a way to engage her, to prove to himself that she was just a simple girl after all. Cora wiped her hands on her apron and leaned over the map, her eyes scanning it with a startling intensity. She studied the lines and markings, the elevations and water sources, for a long, quiet minute. Rex watched her, expecting confusion. He saw only focus. Then she pulled out the new journal and a pencil. She didn't write words. She began to draw on a blank page. She sketched a simplified version of the northern sector, then drew a series of small, interconnected lines between two streams he had considered separate. She pointed to a high ridge, then drew a dotted line from a southern hunting ground, indicating a shorter, more direct path his scouts had apparently missed. Her solution wasn't about moving groups. It was about sharing resources more intelligently and using the land more efficiently. It was brilliant. It was a level of strategic thinking he'd never considered. Rex stared at the drawing, then at her, his mouth slightly agape. "You see the land?" he murmured, astonished. "You really see it." In that moment, the last of his arrogant assumptions about her crumbled to dust. This was not a weakling. This was a strategist. This was a mind. A strange, powerful feeling bloomed in his chest, warm and unsettling. It was more than respect. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something he couldn't name but that made the world seem suddenly vividly different. The tough, unbreakable Alpha King was being undone, not by a challenge of strength, but by a quiet girl with a piece of charcoal and a mind that left him in awe. The fragile, awkward connection between Rex and Cora became a secret thread woven into the daily life of the pack, invisible to all but them and the ever-observant Jax. Their interactions were no longer just about strategic puzzles or clumsy gifts. They settled into a new, quiet routine. Rex, the mighty alpha who had once believed conversation was a tool for giving orders, now found himself seeking out moments of silence with her. He would find a reason to be near the well when she fetched water, or he would linger near the healer's den under the pretense of checking on supplies. He started bringing his own concerns to her, not just maps of territory, but the heavier weights that came with his crown. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the sky, he found her sitting alone on a fallen log at the edge of the main clearing, watching the pups of the pack play a chaotic game of tag. He approached slowly, the usual thunder of his footsteps softened. He sat down beside her, leaving a careful space between them. The silence was comfortable, not empty. For a long while they just watched the pups tumbling in the grass. "Sometimes," Rex began, his voice a low, uncharacteristically vulnerable rumble, "the weight of it all is heavy." He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at his own large hands, clenched into fists on his knees. "Every decision is mine. If the hunt fails, it's my failure. If a warrior falls, it's my loss. They all look to me for strength, for answers. And some days," he trailed off, the admission feeling both dangerous and relieving. He had never confessed a moment of doubt to anyone, not even Jax. Cora turned her head to look at him. She didn't reach for her journal. She simply listened, her brown eyes soft and understanding. She nodded once, a slow, deep gesture that said she heard not just his words, but the burden behind them. Her silence wasn't an absence. It was a space for him to fill, a permission to be unkinglike for a moment. In her quiet acceptance, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. Another time he found her in the library nook, a small, dusty room few pack members used. She was carefully sketching a flower in her journal. He pulled up a chair, the old wood groaning under his weight. "Tell me about the forest," he said quietly. "That night. What was it like?" He wasn't asking for a strategy now. He was asking for her. Cora looked up, a shadow of the old fear passing through her eyes before it was replaced by that familiar resolve. She opened her journal to a fresh page and began to draw. She didn't draw the monsters or the terror. She drew the practicalities. She sketched the cave, the thorn barrier, the stream. Then she drew something new, the way the moonlight had filtered through the canopy in a single silvery beam, illuminating a patch of glowing moss. She drew the curious bright eyes of a fox that had watched her from a distance, not with hunger but with a strange kinship. She was showing him that her night of terror had also contained moments of stark, lonely beauty. She was sharing her world with him. Rex watched her hand move, each line a revelation. He wasn't just seeing a survival story, he was seeing how her mind worked, how she found pockets of light in the overwhelming dark. He was falling in love with her perspective, with her resilience, with her quiet soul. The feeling was a slow, warm tide rising within him, undeniable and terrifyingly wonderful. The change in him did not go unnoticed. The pack saw their alpha's frequent, solitary walks with the silent Omega. They saw the way his fierce scowl would soften when he glanced her way. They saw him, on more than one occasion, carrying a heavy basket of laundry for her from the stream, a task no alpha would ever deign to do. The rumors began to shift from curiosity to something else. For some, it was a fascinating development, a sign that their tough king had a heart after all. For others, like a sharp-eyed she-wolf named Mina, it was an outrage. Mina had always envisioned herself as the future alpha female. She was strong, beautiful in a conventional way and from a good family. She had patiently waited for Rex to notice her, believing it was only a matter of time. Now, she watched in fuming disbelief as he was bewitched by a mute nobody, a weakling who had somehow tricked her way into his good graces. Every smile Rex aimed at Cora, every moment he spent in her company, felt like a personal insult to Mina. A bitter, jealous anger began to curdle inside her, and she started whispering her own version of events to anyone who would listen. He feels sorry for her, that's all, she'd sneer. It's a king's pity. It won't last. But her eyes told a different story, a story of seething envy and a plan to put the quiet Omega back in her place. The tension was a storm gathering at the edges of the pack's consciousness, but in the center of it, Rex and Cora existed in their own quiet world. One afternoon, he found her trying to reach a high branch where a useful medicinal herb was growing. Without a word, he stepped behind her. He didn't push her aside or reach for it himself. He simply stood there, his presence a solid wall of warmth at her back, and easily plucked the sprig of leaves, his arm brushing gently against her shoulder. Cora turned, her face tilted up to his, their bodies closer than they had ever been. The air between them crackled with a new, potent energy. Rex looked down into her eyes, seeing his own reflection in their warm depths. He saw the strong, brave, beautiful woman who had challenged his world and was now quietly stealing his heart. He slowly brought the herb up, not to hand it to her, but to tuck it gently behind her ear, his fingers lingering for a heartbeat against her hair. Cora's breath hitched. A faint blush colored her cheeks. She didn't pull away. She just looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw it all. The trust, the understanding, and a flicker of the same powerful feeling that was making his own heart pound against his ribs. No words were spoken. None were needed. The message was clear in the charged silence, in the proximity of their bodies, in the simple, intimate gesture. Something had shifted, irrevocably and beautifully. The game was over. This was real. The fragile peace that had settled over Rex and Cora's growing connection was a delicate soap bubble, shimmering with beautiful, impossible colors, and it was only a matter of time before someone sharp popped it. That someone was Mina. Her jealousy had festered in the dark corners of the pack, growing from a private resentment into a poisonous vine that sought to strangle the new life blooming between the Alpha and the Omega. She watched their every interaction with narrowed, hateful eyes, and she began her work quietly, strategically, like a wolf circling a herd, looking for the weakest member to pick off. She started with the warriors, the ones who were most loyal to Rex's old ways, the ones who still viewed Cora's survival as a fluke or a trick. It's strange, don't you think? Mina would murmur, her voice a confiding whisper near the training grounds. That someone so small, so weak, could survive the Darkwood where our strongest would fail? The forest is magic, old magic. Dark magic. What kind of deal do you think she made to walk out of there? She let the insidious question hang in the air, planting a seed of doubt that took root in suspicious minds. She moved on to the caregivers and the older pack members, those who were more superstitious. Have you noticed the way the Alpha looks at her? She'd say, her tone dripping with false concern. It's not natural. It's like a spell. She doesn't even speak. What power does she have over him? What has she done to his mind? She twisted their genuine concern for their king into a weapon, painting Cora not as a victim of cruelty but as its sinister architect. The rumor spread like a sickness. Where before Cora had been looked upon with awe or curiosity, she now faced sidelong glances that were tinged with fear and distrust. Whispers followed her that were no longer about her bravery but about witchcraft and unnatural pacts. A young pup scurried away from her when she offered a healing balm for his scraped knee. A group of warriors she passed fell into a sudden, uncomfortable silence. The pack, once a unified whole, was beginning to fracture along the fault lines Mina had carefully engineered. The breaking point came during the weekly pack gathering. It was a time for airing grievances and sharing news, usually a calm affair. Rex stood before the pack, Cora sitting off to the side as had become their new normal. Mina saw her chance. She stepped forward into the center of the circle, her face a mask of righteous worry. "My Alpha," she began, her voice loud and clear, demanding everyone's attention. "I speak today out of loyalty to you and to the pack." She turned, her finger pointing dramatically at Cora. "We are all concerned. This creature, she does not belong among us. Her survival in the Darkwood was not natural. She practices dark arts. She has clouded your judgment, my king. She has bewitched you. A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd. Cora's head snapped up, her eyes wide with hurt and confusion. She shook her head frantically, a denial she could not voice. Rex's face, which had been open and calm moments before, darkened instantly. A low, dangerous growl started deep in his chest. "You dare?" he said, his voice a whiplash of fury. "You dare to speak such lies before your alpha? They are not lies." Mina insisted, emboldened by the support she felt from the nervous crowd. "Look at her. She doesn't speak. What is she hiding? How else could a weak Omega survive? How else could she have captivated you so completely? It is magic. Dark magic. She is a danger to us all. She must be cast out before her poison destroys our pack from within." The accusation hung in the air, toxic and devastating. The pack was on a knife's edge, some members nodding in agreement with Mina, others looking to Rex, terrified of his reaction. Cora looked utterly shattered. The cruel words were a different kind of monster, one she couldn't hide from in a cave. She shrunk in on herself, the strength she had shown in the forest melting under the heat of public hatred and false claims. She began to rise as if to flee the circle, to run from the pain. But before she could take a step, a shadow fell over her. Rex moved with a speed that blurred. He did not go to Mina. He did not address the crowd. In 2 great strides he was at Cora's side. And then, in a move that silenced the entire clearing more completely than any roar could have, he did the unthinkable. He turned to face the pack, but he placed his own massive, powerful body directly in front of Cora, shielding her completely from view. He became her living fortress. He drew himself up to his full, imposing height, and the power that rolled off him was not just that of a king, but of a protector, a mate defending his own. His eyes, burning with a cold, terrifying fire, swept over his people, finally landing on a pale and suddenly frightened Mina. "You speak of poison?" he roared, his voice shaking the very ground. "The only poison here is the venom from your tongue. You speak of strength? You know nothing of it. True strength is not just in the muscle that swings an axe. It is in the heart that endures. It is in the mind that finds a way when there is none. It is in the spirit that remains kind in a world that is cruel." He took a step toward Mina and she flinched back. Cora survived the Darkwood through her intelligence, her courage, and her will. Qualities you clearly know nothing about. She has more strength in her smallest finger than you have in your entire body. And she has my trust. She has my respect. He turned his gaze to the whole pack, his expression unforgiving. "And she is under my protection. Let me be perfectly clear. To question her is to question me. To disrespect her is to disrespect your alpha. And if any one of you," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that carried to every ear, "has a problem with that, you can answer to me directly. Now." The silence that followed was absolute. Mina looked as if she had been struck. Her plan had blown up in her face spectacularly. Instead of turning the pack against Cora, Rex had united himself with her completely, staking his own authority on her innocence and worth. Rex didn't wait for a response. He turned his back on his entire pack, a ultimate sign of his contempt for their disloyalty. He looked down at Cora, who was staring up at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears, but now also with a dawning, awestruck wonder. Without a word, he gently took her elbow, his touch infinitely tender compared to the fury of moments before, and guided her away from the staring crowd, leading her toward the safety of his lodge, leaving a stunned and silent pack, and a utterly defeated Mina in his wake. The line had been drawn, and he had chosen his side. The heavy wooden door of the Alpha's lodge closed behind them with a soft, definitive thud, shutting out the stunned silence of the pack and sealing them in a world of their own. The air inside was still and warm, smelling of pine smoke and leather. The fury that had radiated from Rex like a heat haze in the clearing was gone, replaced by a tense, protective energy that filled the spacious room. He gently guided Cora to a large, upholstered chair near the cold fireplace, his hand on her elbow a steadying presence. She sank into it, her body trembling slightly from the aftershocks of the public confrontation. She looked small and vulnerable, surrounded by the evidence of his raw power, the massive fur rugs, the weapons mounted on the walls, the sheer scale of everything that was him. Rex stood before her, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the window. He ran a hand through his dark hair, the gesture one of rare agitation. "I should have seen it," he growled, the sound low and frustrated, directed at himself. "I should have known her jealousy would fester into this poison." He began to pace the length of the hearth rug, a caged tiger. "She questioned your honor. She questioned my judgment. She challenged my authority in front of the entire pack. Each statement was another log on the fire of his anger. He stopped and looked at her, his stormy eyes blazing. She will answer for it. I will make sure of it. But as he spoke of punishment and answers, a new, more chilling thought occurred to him. Mina's accusations, though born of malice, had been clever. They preyed on fear and superstition. They had found a foothold. To simply punish Mina without disproving her claims would not be enough. The doubt would linger like a bad smell, forever clinging to Cora, and by extension to him. The pack needed proof. They needed to see the truth with their own eyes. He needed to rip the lies out by the root and expose them for what they were. He stopped his pacing and knelt before Cora's chair, bringing himself down to her eye level. The action was so intimate, so devoid of his usual alpha pride, that it made her breath catch. Cora, he said, his voice now soft, earnest. What she said, it can't stand. The pack, they heard her. Some of them believed her. I can't just command them to unbelieve it. He searched her face, his expression pleading for her understanding. I need to know everything. I need you to show me. I need to be able to show them. Will you tell me? All of it? Every single thing you did that night? He wasn't demanding. He was asking. He was placing his trust, his authority, his very ability to protect her, in her hands. He was acknowledging that her truth was the only thing that could save them both. Cora looked into his eyes and saw the fear there, not fear for himself but fear for her, fear of failing her. She saw the king humbling himself before the Omega, not out of weakness but out of strength. She nodded slowly, her initial hurt and fear melting away, replaced by a steely resolve. She reached for her journal and pencils, which she now carried always, and opened it to a blank page. Rex called for Jax. When the beta entered, his face grim with concern from the scene in the clearing, Rex explained the plan. We are going to settle this. Now, gather the pack. Everyone. Tell them their alpha demands it. Back in the clearing, the pack assembled once more, the atmosphere thick with anxiety and anticipation. They expected a punishment, a banishment. They expected to see Mina dragged away. Instead, they saw Rex standing beside Cora's chair, a fierce protector. Jax stood on her other side, his arms crossed, his face a mask of stern support. Rex's voice boomed across the gathering, not in anger but with the clear, ringing tone of a judge. Mina has made grave accusations, he began. She claims Cora used dark magic to survive the Darkwood and to influence her alpha. These are not just attacks on Cora, they are an insult to this pack's intelligence and to my leadership. So we will have the truth. The whole truth. He nodded to Cora. And she began. She didn't speak. She drew. Jax, acting as her herald, held up each page of her journal for the entire pack to see, and he spoke her words for her, his voice clear and strong. She drew the cave behind the thorns. Jax explained how she sought shelter too small for large predators. She drew the circle of crushed moonweed. Jax described its sharp, unpleasant smell that wards off animals. She drew the berry bush in the stream, and Jax told of how she watched the wildlife to know what was safe to eat and drink. She drew the large predators snuffling at the edge of her herbal barrier, turning away in disgust. She drew the single beam of moonlight that gave her comfort. She drew the hours of endless, terrified listening, of relying on her wits and her knowledge alone. With each drawing, each explanation from Jax, the ridiculousness of Mina's claims became glaringly obvious. This wasn't dark magic. This was brilliant survival. This was courage of a kind they had never considered. This was the quiet, practical intelligence of an Omega, the very skills they relied on for healing and foraging, turned into the tools that saved a life. As the story unfolded, the pack's attitude shifted. The suspicious glances turned to ones of dawning respect. The fearful whispers became murmurs of admiration. They saw it now. They saw her. When the last drawing was shown, a simple sketch of the sunrise scene from the mouth of the cave, a profound silence fell. The truth was undeniable. Rex turned his gaze to Mina, who stood pale and shaking, utterly exposed. You see, he said, his voice cold and flat. No magic. No tricks. Only strength you are too blind and too spiteful to recognize. Your words were poison. You sought to divide my pack out of petty jealousy. For that, there is no place for you here. He pronounced her sentence not with a shout, but with a final, terrifying calm. You are banished. You will leave our territory by sundown and never return. If you do, you will be treated as an intruder. Now get out of my sight. There were no protests. The pack watched in silence as Mina, her head bowed in utter defeat, turned and stumbled away, her dreams of power and status turned to ashes. Rex then looked out over his people, his expression hardening once more into that of their king. "Let this be an end to it," he commanded. "The matter is settled. The truth is known." And this time when he looked at Cora, the entire pack looked with him, and they no longer saw a weak Omega or a mysterious witch. They saw the woman who had survived the Darkwood. They saw the strength their alpha saw, and they began to understand. With Mina's banishment, a palpable tension seeped out of the Mooncrest pack, like air slowly leaking from a punctured tire. The malicious whispers ceased, the suspicious glances softened into nods of respect, and the air itself seemed easier to breathe. The pack, having witnessed the truth laid bare, now looked upon Cora with a newfound reverence. She was no longer the silent outsider, she was the resilient survivor, the clever strategist, the one who had withstood not only the Darkwood but the venom of one of their own. She had earned her place not through a challenge of strength, but through the undeniable power of her character. For Rex and Cora, the world narrowed to the space between them. The external pressures and dangers that had forced them together were gone, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their feelings. It was a new, terrifying, and exhilarating frontier. Their interactions, once filled with the practicalities of survival and strategy, now hummed with a different kind of energy. A simple brush of hands as he passed her a bowl of stew sent a jolt through them both. A shared glance across the crowded dining hall could make the rest of the world fade into a meaningless blur. The unspoken understanding that had grown between them now yearned for a voice, for a physical language to match the depth of what they felt in their hearts. The night of the full moon arrived, a massive luminous pearl hanging in a velvet black sky. It was a night of power and wild energy for the pack, a time when most would shed their human skins and run through the territory as wolves, celebrating their primal nature. But tonight Rex sought a different kind of celebration. He found Cora standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the others begin their transformation, her face bathed in the silvery light. She looked ethereal, beautiful, and a little sad, as if she felt separate from the joyful chaos. He walked up beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. "You don't have to run with them," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that blended with the distant howls starting to rise into the night. "Come with me." He didn't wait for a journal or a nod. He simply held out his hand. Cora looked from his offered hand to his face, her eyes searching his. What she saw there, not a command but a heartfelt invitation, made her place her small hand trustingly in his large, calloused one. The connection was electric, a completed circuit that sent a shock of warmth through both of them. He led her away from the noise and the crowd, not toward the wild forests, but up a narrow, winding path that led to a high cliff overlooking the entire territory. It was his place, a solitary retreat where he went to think. No one else ever came here. The world fell away below them, a tapestry of dark trees and moonlight-dappled clearings. The sounds of the pack were a distant, joyful song. Above them the moon shone, immense and brilliant. They stood there together, hand in hand, looking out at the kingdom he ruled and the world she had helped him see anew. The silence between them was no longer filled with things unsaid, it was filled with a perfect, mutual understanding. It was deep and warm and heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Rex turned to face her, both of his hands now enveloping hers. The powerful Alpha King looked suddenly vulnerable, his stormy eyes serious and soft. "Cora," he began, his voice husky with emotion. "Before you, my world was simple. It was about strength, about power, about command. I thought that was all there was. I thought that was everything." He took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "You walked into that darkness and you showed me a different kind of strength. You showed me patience. You showed me intelligence. You showed me a heart so brave and so kind that it changed me." He brought one hand up to gently cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin with a reverence that made her breath catch. "You saw the man behind the crown. You weren't afraid of me. You challenged me. You fascinated me. He struggled for the words, this man who was never at a loss. You quieted the storm inside me." He leaned closer, his forehead gently resting against hers. They breathed the same air. "I don't have the words to make this a grand speech," he whispered. "All I have is the truth. I love you, Cora. Not because I pity you. Not because I owe you. But because you are the strongest, most amazing person I have ever known. You are my equal. You are my mate. My heart is yours. It has been since the moment you walked out of that forest and left me speechless." Tears welled in Cora's eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming, joyous emotion. She had never heard anything more beautiful. She had spent a lifetime communicating without words, but now she needed him to understand the depth of what she felt. She reached up, her hands framing his face, her touch saying what her voice could not. She pulled his head down gently until his lips were a breath from hers. And then she closed the final, tiny distance. The kiss was not hesitant or questioning. It was a confirmation. It was a promise. It was soft and deep and filled with a lifetime of silent longing finally given voice. It tasted of truth and love and a future they would build together. Rex's arms wrapped around her, pulling her tightly against him, not in a claim of possession, but in a gesture of belonging, as if he was finally making his heart his home, and she was the center of it. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Cora's eyes shone with happy tears and a radiant, beautiful smile, a rare, full smile that lit up her entire face, was his answer. She didn't need to write a word. Her joy, her love, her acceptance were written in the glow of her skin, the light in her eyes, and the way she leaned into him, trusting him with her whole heart. Under the witness of the full moon, surrounded by the sounds of their pack celebrating below, they stood wrapped in each other's arms, two halves of a whole finally made complete. The silent Omega and the speechless Alpha had found a language all their own, and it was more powerful than any howl or any word ever spoken. The change that settled over the Mooncrest pack in the weeks that followed was not a loud, dramatic revolution, but a quiet, profound transformation, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long, hard winter. The air, once thick with tension and the rigid hierarchy of raw power, now felt lighter, warmer, more welcoming. The source of this change radiated from the very top, from the Alpha and his chosen mate. Rex, once a ruler defined by his stern scowl and unyielding demands for strength, now carried himself with a different kind of authority. The constant storm in his eyes had softened to a steady, confident calm. He still led with firmness, his decisions were still final, but they were now tempered with a wisdom that had been absent before. You listen more. He considered the well-being of the youngest pup and the oldest elder with the same seriousness he once reserved for border security. He had learned that a pack's strength was not just in the sharpness of its claws, but in the health of its whole body, and that was a lesson taught to him by the quiet Omega who walked by his side. Cora's presence in the pack was no longer that of an outsider tolerated on a technicality. She had been woven into the very fabric of their daily life, her unique skills not just accepted but celebrated. She worked alongside the healers, her knowledge of herbs now respected and sought after. She helped organize the food stores with a clever efficiency that prevented waste. And though she still communicated with her journal and her expressive hands, no one viewed her silence as a weakness anymore. It was simply a part of who she was, and her actions spoke with a clarity and volume that drowned out any need for words. The pack looked to her not with pity or suspicion, but with genuine respect and a growing affection. She was their living reminder that courage came in many forms. The announcement of the coronation ceremony was met not with shock, but with a sense of rightness, a feeling of a story reaching its perfect and inevitable conclusion. On the day itself, the entire pack gathered in the main clearing which had been transformed. Garlands of autumn flowers and deep green pine boughs were hung between the lodges, and the central fire burned high and bright, its flames reaching for a clear blue sky. There was a palpable sense of joy and unity, a feeling of a new beginning for everyone. When Rex and Cora emerged from his lodge, a collective sigh of awe swept through the crowd. Rex stood tall and proud, clad in his formal Alpha's gear, a dark leather tunic etched with the silver symbols of his lineage. But all eyes were drawn to Cora. She wore a simple gown of deep forest green that mirrored the color of the pines, and a delicate circlet of twisted silver oak leaves rested upon her brow. She did not look like a traditional queen of war and conquest. She looked like a queen of the earth itself, of resilience and quiet growth. She stood beside Rex, not behind him, her head held high, her hand resting confidently in the crook of his arm. The ceremony was ancient and simple. The oldest member of the pack, a grizzled elder with a voice like rolling stone, recited the old vows. Rex pledged his strength, his life, and his loyalty to the protection and prosperity of the pack. Then he turned to Cora. In a move that broke from centuries of tradition where the alpha female's role was assumed, he spoke vows directly to her. "I pledge to you," he said, his voice strong and clear for all to hear, "to value your wisdom as I value my own strength, to see the pack through your eyes as well as mine, to rule with you beside you always." He then took the silver circlet and, with infinite tenderness, placed it upon her head. It was not a crown of domination but a crown of partnership. The pack erupted in cheers, howls of approval that shook the very trees. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated acceptance and joy. As their people celebrated around them, Rex turned to Cora. He didn't see the Omega he had once scorned. He saw his equal, his partner, his love. He saw the woman whose silent strength had given a voice to his own heart. He leaned down and in front of everyone he kissed her, a kiss that was both a promise and a celebration. Later, as the festivities continued with feasting and music, Rex and Cora stole a quiet moment alone, looking out over their thriving pack, their home. Rex's arm was around her shoulders, holding her close against his side. He looked down at the silver circlet on her brow, glinting in the firelight. "It suits you," he murmured. "My queen." Cora smiled, one of those radiant smiles that was reserved only for him. She reached into a small pouch at her belt and pulled out her journal and a pencil. She wrote a single sentence and held it up for him to read. The words were simple, but they held the weight of every challenge they had faced, every fear they had overcome, and every moment of love they had found. "Our strength is together." Rex read the words, and his heart swelled with a happiness so complete it was almost painful. He looked from the page to her eyes, and he knew that his journey from a lonely king to a complete man was finally over. The silent Omega and the speechless Alpha had built a language of their own, a kingdom of their own, and a love that would be told in legends for generations to come. Their story was a testament to the fact that the strongest bonds are often forged in the darkest nights, and that the quietest hearts often hold the most powerful love. And so, under the watchful moon, the Mooncrest Pack began a new golden age, led by a king who had learned to listen and a queen who spoke volumes without ever saying a word. Their tale of survival, understanding and unwavering love was far from over. In fact, with every passing day, they were writing its next beautiful chapter together.